He was the richest man who ever lived, the wisest man who ever lived, and he still destroyed his own kingdom with one decision God told him, in plain language, never to make. His name was Solomon, and by the end of his life, he had 1,000 women living inside his palace walls, 700 wives, 300 concubines. Today I'm going to walk you through exactly why God let this happen, what it actually cost him, and what this story is really trying to tell every single one of us who thinks we're too wise, too blessed, or too far along in our faith to ever fall the way he did. Stick with me until the very end, because the final chapter of Solomon's life, the part almost nobody talks about, might be the most important part of the whole story. Let's start with the number itself, because it's almost hard to wrap your mind around. 1,000 women, not a rumor, not an exaggeration passed down through folklore. The Bible states it in plain, unemotional language. In 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 3, Solomon had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. Read that number again? 700 wives, plus 300 more women in addition to that. For context, most kings in the ancient Near East might have had a handful of political marriages, maybe a dozen at most for the wealthiest and most powerful rulers. Solomon didn't just break the record. He shattered it so completely that it's almost hard to categorize what he did as marriage in any normal sense of the word anymore. So here's the question that keeps people coming back to this story, generation after generation. If God is sovereign, if nothing happens outside his will, why did he let this happen? Did God approve of it? Did he bless it? Did he simply look away and let Solomon do whatever he wanted because he was rich and powerful? That question matters, because how you answer it tells you a lot about how you understand the relationship between God's sovereignty, human freedom, and human consequences. Here's the short answer, and then we're going to spend the rest of this video unpacking it piece by piece. God allowed Solomon to make this choice, but allowing something and approving of something are two completely different realities. Solomon's marriages were not a gift from God. They were not some reward for his wisdom or his wealth. They were a direct, deliberate violation of a command God had given centuries before Solomon was even born, and the Bible treats them as exactly that, sin, with real, painful, generational consequences. To understand why this was such a massive deal, we need to rewind the clock. Long before there was ever a king ruling over Israel, God gave specific instructions through Moses about what a future king could and could not do. This is written down in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. God said the king could not accumulate large numbers of horses for himself. He could not accumulate silver and gold for himself in excess, and he could not take many wives, because doing so would turn his heart away from the Lord. Notice something important here, because it changes the whole way you should read this story. These weren't random restrictions handed down just to test obedience for its own sake. Each one guarded against a specific, predictable danger. Too many horses meant a king would start trusting in military power instead of trusting in God to protect the nation. Too much silver and gold meant a king would start trusting in wealth instead of trusting in God to provide. And too many wives, especially wives brought in from foreign nations that worshipped other gods, meant the king's heart would eventually, gradually, get pulled toward idolatry. God wasn't being controlling for the sake of control here. He was protecting the king, and through the king, protecting the entire nation from the exact trap that has swallowed nearly every empire in human history: pride, excess, and divided loyalty that slowly hollows out devotion from the inside. Now let's actually bring Solomon into this picture, because here's something people often forget. His story doesn't start with failure. It starts with genuine, remarkable promise. When Solomon's father, King David, was near the end of his life, he gave his son a final charge. It's recorded in 1 Kings chapter 2. David told Solomon to be strong, to show himself a man, and to walk in the ways of the Lord, keeping his commands exactly as they were written in the law of Moses. This wasn't vague, generic fatherly advice about being a good person. David was pointing his son directly back to those same instructions we just talked about, the ones specifically limiting a king's wives, his wealth, and his military buildup. David knew the danger. He had lived through his own share of moral failure, and he wanted his son to avoid the mistakes he himself had made. In the beginning, remarkably, Solomon actually listened. In 1 Kings chapter 3, we get one of the most famous scenes in the entire Old Testament. God appears to Solomon in a dream and tells him to ask for whatever he wants. Anything at all, no limits. Solomon could have asked for unlimited wealth. He could have asked for a long life stretching decades beyond a normal lifespan. He could have asked for the total military destruction of every enemy nation surrounding Israel. Instead, he asked for wisdom, a discerning heart to govern God's people well, and the ability to tell the difference between right and wrong in real, complicated situations. God was so pleased with this request that he didn't just grant it. He gave Solomon wisdom beyond anyone who had come before him or would come after him, and he threw in riches and honor on top of that, simply because Solomon hadn't asked for those things selfishly in the first place. This is the same Solomon who would go on to write large portions of the book of Proverbs, absolutely packed with practical wisdom about self-control, integrity, discipline, and honoring God in the small, everyday decisions of ordinary life. This is the same Solomon who wrote the Song of Solomon, a beautifully poetic celebration of committed, exclusive, faithful love between one husband and one wife. In other words, Solomon didn't just understand the right path intellectually, from a distance. He wrote entire books about it. He understood, arguably better than almost anyone else in recorded history, exactly what God intended marriage, self-discipline, and devotion to look like. So how does a man like that, a man with that much wisdom, that much insight, and that much access to God's own instructions, end up with 1,000 women in his household by the end of his life? The Bible doesn't hide the answer, and it doesn't try to soften Solomon's image or make excuses for him. Over time, gradually, decision by decision, Solomon drifted. He began marrying foreign women, many of them for political reasons, to seal alliances with neighboring kingdoms and secure trade relationships and border peace. On the surface, that might sound strategic, even wise, in the way ancient Near Eastern politics typically worked, where marriage was treated as a diplomatic tool as much as a personal relationship. Kings married the daughters of rival kings all the time to formalize treaties and prevent war. But here's the problem. It was in direct, unmistakable violation of what God had specifically commanded for the kings of Israel. And Solomon knew it. He wasn't ignorant of the rule. He had grown up hearing it from his own father. He had more direct access to God's wisdom than any human being in recorded history. And he chose to override the command anyway, alliance by alliance, marriage by marriage, treaty by treaty, until the count reached 1,000 women living under his roof. Here's where the story turns from concerning to genuinely devastating. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4, gives us the outcome in a single, sobering sentence. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was no longer fully devoted to the Lord his God, the way his father David's heart had been. This is exactly what Deuteronomy had warned would happen, centuries before Solomon was even born. It wasn't a surprise to God. It wasn't some unpredictable twist of fate. It was the entirely predictable, almost inevitable result of ignoring a boundary that existed specifically to protect him from this outcome. And it got worse from there. According to 1 Kings 11, verses 7 and 8, Solomon didn't just passively tolerate his wife's foreign religious practices from a safe distance. He actively participated. He personally built high places of worship for gods like Chemosh and Molech, deities associated with practices the Bible describes as detestable, including child sacrifice in some ancient Near Eastern religious systems. Think about that for a second. The wisest man who ever lived, the man who wrote entire books urging people to pursue God wholeheartedly, ended up personally constructing altars to false gods, just to keep peace with women he was never supposed to marry in the first place. That's how far the slow drift eventually carried him. Before we go any further into what happened next, I want to pause here for a moment, because I think this is exactly the point in the story where most of us need to stop and really sit with it honestly. If this story is landing with you the way I think it should, do me a favor right now and hit that subscribe button, and tap the like button too. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it means more videos like this one, breaking these stories down in a way that actually makes them matter for your life today, not just as distant ancient history. Also, drop a comment down below and let me know something. Do you think Solomon's downfall was really about the danger of small compromises? Or was it more fundamentally about the danger of unchecked power once you have absolutely nothing left to lose? I'll be reading through the comments, and I might feature some of your answers in a future video. Alright, let's get back into the story, because the consequences of Solomon's choices are exactly where this becomes something every single one of us genuinely needs to hear. God did not let any of this slide quietly. In 1 Kings 11, verse 11, God speaks directly to Solomon and tells him that because he did not keep the covenant and the decrees God had commanded him to keep, the kingdom would be torn away from him and given to one of his own subordinates. Let that sink in for a moment. The kingdom Solomon spent decades building, the magnificent temple he constructed in Jerusalem, the enormous wealth he accumulated through trade and tribute from surrounding nations, the international reputation he built as the wisest and most successful ruler on the entire earth, with foreign queens literally traveling great distances just to witness his wisdom firsthand. All of it was going to be ripped apart because of choices he made about who he let into his household and ultimately who he let into his heart. There is mercy woven into this judgment as well, and it's worth pointing out because it shows something important about how God deals with even serious, repeated sin. God tells Solomon that for the sake of his father David, he would not tear the kingdom apart during Solomon's own lifetime. The full weight of the consequence would fall on his son instead. But make no mistake about what this actually meant. This wasn't Solomon getting away with anything. It was a delayed sentence, not a canceled one. And beyond that specific political judgment, Solomon's later years were also increasingly marked by conflict and opposition. God specifically raised up adversaries against him, including the Edomites and the Arameans, nations that had previously been kept in check, but now became active sources of instability and threat. The peace and stability that had defined the early, faithful years of his reign simply didn't last. It couldn't last. Not once the foundation underneath it had already been quietly compromised for years. Eventually, after Solomon's death, the United Kingdom did split into two rival nations, exactly as God had said it would, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, torn apart from what had once been one unified kingdom under David and Solomon. That single division shaped the entire remaining course of Israel's history throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Generations of conflict, division, and spiritual decline that can be traced directly back to decisions made in one man's private life, decisions that felt small and justifiable one at a time, but became catastrophic once you added them all together. Now here's the part of this story that I think gets skipped the most often, and honestly, I think it might be the single most powerful piece of the entire narrative. Toward the very end of his life, after all of this, after the wives, after the idolatry, after the direct warning from God, after watching his kingdom begin to unravel around him in real time, Solomon sat down and wrote one more book. It's called Ecclesiastes, and it reads almost like a confession, the honest reflection of an old man looking back on his life with brutal, unflinching clarity. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 8, Solomon writes openly about everything he accumulated over the course of his reign. Silver, gold, treasures, gathered from kings and provinces across the region, and yes, he specifically mentions his harem, describing it using language that translates roughly as the delights of the heart of man. He's not hiding from what he did, he's naming it directly, without excuse or softening. And then, just a few verses later, in Ecclesiastes 2 verse 11, he delivers his final verdict on all of it. He looks back at everything he built across an entire lifetime, every palace, every vineyard, every wife, every single ounce of gold he ever collected, and he calls the whole thing meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing gained, in the end, from any of it. Sit with that for a second. The man who had access to more pleasure, more power, more wealth, and more relationships than almost anyone else in recorded human history, looked back at all of it near the end of his life, and said, "It amounted to nothing lasting." Not because those things were inherently worthless in themselves, but because he had pursued them completely outside of the boundaries God had originally set for him. And boundaries God sets are never arbitrary rules designed to limit our fun. They exist because God understands something fundamental about human nature and human happiness that we tend to conveniently forget the moment we start believing we're somehow the exception to the rule. Solomon doesn't end the book of Ecclesiastes stuck in despair, though. He ends it with the conclusion he clearly wished he had lived by from the very beginning of his reign, not just discovered near the very end. In chapter 12, verse 13, he writes what he calls the conclusion of the whole matter: "Fear God and keep his commandments, because this is the entire duty of mankind." Then in verse 14, he adds one final sobering thought: "God will bring every deed into judgment, including everything hidden, whether it was good or whether it was bad." That's not the bitterness of an old man complaining about how things turned out. That's the wisest man who ever lived, handing us the hard-earned lesson of his entire life, completely free of charge, tucked into the back of a book that sat quietly in the Bible for roughly 3,000 years, patiently waiting for someone to actually read it and take it seriously. So let's bring this all the way back to the exact question we started with tonight. Did God approve of Solomon's 1,000 wives and concubines? No. Not even remotely close. God allowed Solomon to make his own choices, because that's fundamentally how God designed human beings from the very beginning, with real freedom and real, unavoidable responsibility attached to that freedom. But allowing a choice is never the same thing as blessing it or endorsing it. Solomon had every possible advantage a person could ever have: unmatched, God-given wisdom, a father who gave him clear, godly counsel before he died, direct, personal access to God's own written instructions, laid out specifically for kings. And he still drifted, slowly, one political alliance and one marriage at a time, until eventually his heart simply wasn't fully his own anymore. Here's why this particular story still matters so much today, thousands of years after it was first written down. Most of us are obviously never going to have 700 wives or 300 concubines. That's clearly not the actual point of the story. The real point is that Solomon's downfall didn't happen in one single dramatic moment of obvious, glaring rebellion. It happened gradually, through a long series of small compromises that each individually seemed reasonable, even strategic, at the exact moment he made them. One political marriage here, another useful alliance there. Each decision, taken completely on its own, was defensible, even smart by the standards of the day. But collectively, over the course of decades, they became absolutely catastrophic. That's how compromise almost always works, both in Solomon's life and in ours, 3,000 years later. It rarely shows up as one obvious, dramatic sin that you can clearly see coming from a mile away. It shows up as a slow, quiet accumulation of small, individually justifiable choices that gradually pull your heart further and further away from what you already know, deep down, to be right, until one day you finally look up and realize just how far you've actually drifted from where you started. Solomon started remarkably well. He asked God for wisdom instead of wealth or power, when he could have asked for absolutely anything. He wrote some of the most profound, enduring spiritual literature in all of human history, and he still ended up personally building altars to false gods, simply because he refused to say no to the wrong relationships when he had every opportunity to walk away. If it could happen to him, with literally everything going for him that a person could possibly have, it's worth asking yourself honestly, right now, where the small, quiet compromises might already be happening in your own life today. Not the big, obvious sins that would be easy to spot from far away. The quiet ones. The ones that feel completely justified and reasonable in the exact moment you're making them. Before you go, I want to ask you for one more thing, and then we'll wrap up for today. If this video actually gave you something real to think about, something genuinely worth sitting with tonight, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next video, because we're going to keep digging into stories exactly like this one, the parts of the Bible that get flattened and oversimplified in Sunday school lessons, but are actually far deeper, far more complicated, and far more relevant to real, everyday life than most people ever realize. Drop a comment down below and tell me which biblical figure you want us to break down next in this same kind of format. I genuinely read every single comment, and a large number of these videos actually come directly from suggestions people leave right here in this section. And if you know someone in your life right now who might need to hear this particular story today, someone standing right at the edge of a compromise that feels small and manageable but really isn't, do them a favor and share this video with them directly. It might be exactly what they need to hear at exactly the right moment. Thank you so much for sticking with me all the way through to the very end of this one. I'll see you in the next video.